Okay, so when you hear the word obedience, what comes to mind? For most of us, it's like a list of rules, right? A checklist. But what if I told you that true obedience isn't really about rules at all? That's the kind of mind-bending idea we're going to dig into today, all thanks to a 17th century thinker named John Owen. So, Owen kicks things off with this really sharp observation. He basically looked around and saw that people loved to argue about the theory of obedience, you know? They'd get into the weeds debating all the fine print. But in all that talk, he noticed something was missing. They were forgetting to actually, be obedient. And that's the central problem he wants to tackle.
So the big question is, what was everybody missing? According to Owen, the entire debate was kind of built on a shaky foundation, a fundamental misunderstanding of the rule book they were all arguing about. So to really get this, we've got to start right there. All right, so Owen's big move here is to say, look, the law in the Old Testament, it's not just one big monolithic thing. He says it actually has two very distinct parts. And getting this difference, well, it's the key that unlocks his entire argument. And this breakdown is it's brilliant. Think of it like this. The moral law, he says, is like the laws of physics. It's universal, it's permanent, it boils down to love God, love your neighbor. But then you have the law of worship, and that was more like, say, a country's specific traffic code. Absolutely essential for those people at that time, but it was never meant to be for everyone forever. And that distinction, it changes literally everything. Okay, so let's zoom in on that first part, the moral law. Now, a really common idea, both back then and even today, is that Christ showed up to give us a kind of moral law 2.0, an updated and improved set of rules. And Owen's take on that? A hard no. Absolutely not. And his logic here is really simple but powerful. He says, look, the moral law is based on God's own perfect nature. So, it was already perfect. You can't improve on perfect. For Owen, the idea of adding a new command just didn't make sense, because that would imply the original was somehow lacking. Okay, so if he didn't come to give a new law, then what exactly was his role? What did he do? Well, he didn't replace it, he reinforced it. You could say he confirmed its timeless authority. He enforced it, but with brand new gospel-centered motivations. And he directed it to its proper ultimate end. So when he called these old commands his commands, it wasn't because he was inventing them. It's because he was now the ultimate authority, the one stamping them with his divine seal of approval. Okay, now let's flip the coin over and look at that other part, the law of worship. And with this, the story is completely different. He didn't just tweak it or reinforce it, he totally replaced it. See, unlike the moral law, which was permanent, this whole system of worship was always meant to be temporary. It was a placeholder. So Christ didn't just come to make some edits. He acted as a brand new founder, a new lawgiver for how we worship. And this just perfectly highlights the contrast, doesn't it? He completely abolished the old system. He instituted new ordinances for the church, and he became the sole and supreme authority on the matter. So for morality, he was a confirmer, but for worship, he was a founder. And this distinction right here is what leads us straight to Owen's main point. So we've seen how Christ dealt with these two different parts of the law. Now we get to the absolute heart of Owen's argument. What does this all mean for us, you and me? What does it actually mean to be obedient? And here it is, the absolute core of it all. For Owen, true Christian obedience is not just doing the things you're commanded to do. It's not a checklist. It's an express subjection, a willing surrender of your soul and your conscience to the personal authority of Christ himself. But why is that so important? Why the big focus on obedience to a person and not just a rule book? Well, Owen gives this really powerful three-part answer that's the bedrock of his whole argument. First, it's because he is divine by nature. He's God. So obedience to him is religious obedience to God. Simple as that. Second, he's the mediator, meaning God has specifically appointed him as the authority over the church. And third, he's the final judge. He's the one we all have to give an account to in the end. It all comes back to who he is. And Owen really doesn't pull any punches here. For him, the divine nature of Christ isn't just a nice idea. It's the non-negotiable foundation. Take that away, and he says any act of religious obedience is simply idolatry. So what's the big takeaway here? I mean, how does this deep dive into a 17th century idea actually change how we think about all this stuff today? Well, it all boils down to a huge shift. A shift away from a checklist and toward a relationship.
Owen draws this incredibly sharp line. On one side, you have moral duties. These are good actions, sure, but they're done in your own strength, just to meet the law's demands. But on the other side, you have evangelical obedience. It's often the exact same action, but it's performed by faith in Christ. It's not motivated by the law itself, but by a love for God that's been revealed in Christ. It's the same what, but a totally different why.
And for worship, the implication is just as huge. If Christ is the sole and supreme lawgiver for worship, then that means our conscience is bound only by his authority and what he's instituted, not human additions, not traditions, not anything else. So in the end, Owen's whole argument is designed to shift our focus entirely. It pulls us away from this frantic, anxious attempt to just perfectly manage a rule book, and it points us towards something much simpler but way more profound: the act of subjecting our conscience to a person. And that changes the fundamental question, right? It goes from, am I doing everything on the list correctly, to whose voice have I chosen to listen to? And that's a thought worth exploring.